given, that's how we live it. Don't be mad at the system, it's simply how we've existed. I hear a lot of people talking like they politicians and choose to be an accountant because it's safe in a business. Not because they want to do it, just because they heard it pays. And who the fuck wants to be poor knowing that's how we've been raised? Society is getting heavy, I can feel the weight. The pressure of success is like 100 million pounds of shit.
How you guys doing today? It's Anthony Gangi. Welcome to another episode of Tier Talk. Today we're going to have a very interesting discussion. We're going to talk about I want to say it's conflict. And what I mean by conflict, and hopefully it's conflict resolution, depending on where the dialogue goes. We've got to figure that out. But basically, sometimes we're going to make the decisions that could have conflicting priorities between different departments. And even though a lot of those decisions are left up to higher level management, because I guess people believe that they have the discretion to handle those decisions. What people don't realize is what fuels those decisions is really what happens on that front line, how they're able to kind of mediate that dispute and then bring a solution to the higher level management, if you will. So if anything, this dialogue is hopefully an attempt to empower the front line to get more involved and to step up when we have those decisions of conflict. And for management, on the other side of that, is to listen. Because the real bulk of the decisions that have to be made that are successful will usually come from the front line, getting involved, partnering with each other, and then bringing that over to management. And again, this idea does come from Connie, another great suggestion. And this dialogue is going to kind of blend a management and a frontline perspective, because I think all parties are involved. But Connie, you mind introducing yourself to our audience and maybe just telling us why you thought about doing this topic?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Connie Alleyne here. I am the founder and president of the Civilian Corrections Academy. I'm also the podcast host of The Fly Behind the Wall and the author of The Cage Was Her Cocoon. I think for me, this topic was most important because I feel that sometimes the front line, I don't know if they always feel like we understand how difficult it could be to make a lot of these decisions on the fly, right? Because we're working under pressure. We're in positions where, we're highly scrutinized, and there's very little forgiveness in corrections when you mess up, right? I mean, especially when people start blaming and covering themselves. So it's, for me, how do we empower the front line to be effective in making those on the fly decisions that are actually going to be supported by management?
Yeah, I think this is going to be a great idea. I also have Soto on. He's been on the front line. He's been in higher level management. So I believe that he could also bring about a great balanced perspective. So Soto, thanks for coming on.
Absolutely, Gangi. And again, welcome to those guys that are just tuning in for the first time or maybe coming back and listening to us chat. Again, I'm Professor Soto. I teach out of Rutgers University, retired major, over 27 years of experience in the correctional field, and I'm happy to add to this dialogue.
Yeah, it's going to be a great discussion. I think there's a lot to be offered here. Now, guys, if you haven't, the show Tier Talks for you, brave men and women that work in corrections. So please subscribe, interact, engage, comment, hit that bell. The bell's going to notify you every time I post a video. We're going to go to our sponsor. We come back. We're going to talk about kind of getting that front line and management working together to solve conflicts that may arise when working, between different departments. Stand by.
I wanted to attend a university that had an intelligence program. I wanted to look at problems different. I wanted to increase my critical thinking abilities. AMU offered those avenues to expand. Obtaining your degree as an adult, you're actually paying yourself and investing in yourself. You can't put a dollar on it. It's priceless. It's something that can never be taken away from you.
American Military University. Learn from the leader.
All right, and we're back. So, Connie, when you first mentioned this idea, the first two departments I saw, and obviously this is not all inclusive, but the first two departments I saw that usually may have some conflict is medical and custody. So what's your thoughts on this relationship between medical and custody? Where does the conflict usually begin, and how is it usually fixed?
So I think sometimes, depending on the situation, we can see where those conflicts happen, right? So like, suppose there's a fight medical. So custody is going to bring them down to medical. We're trying to make sure they're stable. You guys are trying to get information, right? Because gaining the intel in that moment so that you can stabilize the housing unit or wherever, the incident took place may be the priority. I think there are other times where, you guys may be thinking someone's having a behavioral issue, medical or mental health is thinking, no, this person's decompensating. And if custody isn't trained to deal with that population, I think sometimes it's hard to see it as anything other than a behavioral issue, as opposed to it being a medical or mental health issue. And I think when there isn't a good relationship between medical and custody, there is a struggle to hear the other person's side, right? Like, why should we consider this something medical? Not that we don't understand that this could be something medical, but because there is a wedge in that relationship, or maybe even a lack of trust, it may be very difficult to just kind of let's hear them out and figure out what's the best way to stabilize the situation.
And the funny thing is, I think that even from the front line, sometimes we see things as isolated. So I think, like, let's say there's a problem. Let's say there's a conflict between medical and custody. Sometimes what happens here, we figure that maybe the front line figures that the solution is isolated, which means that, custody, it has to be a custody decision, or nope, medical's right. It has to be a medical decision. And very rarely do we ever see where the win comes from when we blend it, when it's a mixture of what works best for both. I think that somehow, for some reason, a lot of us may still have that isolated perspective on the front line. And I actually, when I became management, is really when I started to see, like, hey, isolated perspectives don't work, because when you start representing the bigger picture, it's not about one department winning over the other, because at the end, as management, you lose. If custody wins over medical, that's great for custody, but that may not be so good for medical, which is not so good for management, and vice versa. So there was a need for us to bring things together and find that common solution. But do you see that, Soto, on the ground at the front line? Do you see people looking more for an isolated solution as opposed to solutions that blend?
You're absolutely right on that one. I mean, if I'm talking to you as an officer and behind that mindset, or maybe that first line supervisor, once an incident occurs, we go into, kind of like detective mode. You know what I mean? We kind of have to contain the situation, which we normally do, because if we're going towards the medical department already, well, we've contained some of it, if not all of the incident at that point. And we're going into our, putting that detective hat on and trying to get more intel, more information, like Connie was saying. And we're not thinking about, medical has a job to do. So interestingly enough, when you talk outside of corrections, right, and you're at a hospital and someone comes in with injuries or whatever the case may be, there's no other outside source right now other than tending to a medical emergency or medical, care being given. Inside of an institution, I'm the front line. I'm handling the situation. I might have just had my altercation with this particular inmate because I'm restraining them or trying to separate them from someone else. So taking them to medical is kind of like our protocol, and it's like our policy to go there. That's the next step. But my mindset isn't there yet. My mindset is I have to get to see what started this incident, is there something else going to happen? And I'm not really thinking, medical needs to do their part. And we're not, that's where we don't join in. I'll give you some other examples as we tend to talk a little bit more of what actually brought us about to having to work together. So sometimes we don't work together and it's a choice, but sometimes policy kind of makes us work together. I'll give you some examples in a few.
Yeah, and by the way, I know we're saying a lot about medical and custody, and we kind of use that because that's maybe where you could see some priority shift in regards to, which department feels that their priority is more of a needed priority. So I guess a conflict in priorities. But I'll say it could happen anywhere where if there's policies that are written that are independent of each other, without realizing that, whoa, you know that the policy for mental health in regards to placement just crossed into social services policy into placement. So now you're going to have social services and mental health. So I think some of the confusion would be if the policies are written in an isolated format and they don't realize that they just kind of may have stepped outside of what their usual prescribed role would be. And now the other department who usually picks that up is now wondering like, hey, when are you starting to realize that now you're in my territory? And I know, Connie, from a management level, if you are developing new policies or if you have departments that are coming in to develop new policies, how important is it for the departments to realize how those policies could affect the other departments?
That's absolutely critical, right? Because then we could be fueling the confusion by creating policies that just are counterintuitive. I think ultimately what we find ourselves doing, so my experience is I sat on the policy and procedure committee for 5 years at UConn. And what we would do is we would take the nursing policy, we would take the custody policy as it relates to medical. And every year we went through, and if we changed something in the medical policy, we looked to see if there was impact on the custody policy. So for example, when we started looking at restraints of pregnant women and what that would look like, we didn't put things in policy that would have any conflict with like you guys' security transport policies or procedures, because we just didn't want that to be. I mean, ultimately, we had 1 or 2 doctors who decided they were going to write doctors' orders to not be restrained, which created another mess, right? But the reality was that we tried our best to not look at policies in isolation, simply because they are intertwined to some extent. And there's a way that when we start creating these policies, we actually create the confusion.
Right. And you know what's funny, and I'm sure Soto may be able to help me out with this, is I know in the briefing, like when I'm sure every facility should have this on the admin, we try to bring the picture together. So sometimes we get this very isolated picture, and at the end of the day is that we try to picture what each department's, saying, and then how these pieces work together. And sometimes you can see that with the reports that are written. The reports are, they tell a story from point A to point B, but from different perspectives. And then we as management have to come together and say, okay, you know what, this must go here, this must go there. These two things are just kind of conflicting. So I think what we need to do right from the get-go, especially with, training, is maybe to, let people understand what those other perspectives are. And then hopefully when they do these, whatever these policies are, they know enough to know that if I do this, it's going to affect this. Now, Soto, again, sitting at a briefing, do you think you spend a lot of time, trying to put things together? Because the reports are kind of written in a very, it's silo. It's written like a silo.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And in New Jersey, it came to a point where, every department is writing their reports, meeting their needs, meeting their requirements, right? And then it came to the point where you have to come up with a overall report being written by management called an executive summary, that you were tasked with, okay, here's what, operations or security or correction officers did on that side, the custody level. And then here's what the nursing staff did, or maybe you involved the psych or whatever the case may be. And someone had to put up a report together that kind of encompasses everybody's viewpoint and how the incident occurred from beginning to end. But these are things that should be brought about when you have your department head meetings, right? Where you're having people from every social services, classification, operations. You're having people from every area, and you're having those meetings for a reason. It's not just, okay, department head meeting again. Let's talk about what happened, last week. These are the opportunities where you can gauge from each individual, hey, when incidents occur, when things happen, this is what we're looking for. I enjoyed and really liked that Connie said, hey, they sat down reviewing policy and made particular attention to, if we change our policy, how will it affect custody. And one of the examples I wanted to bring up was that forced us to work together. And on the line level, when we came up with these PREA, right, Prison Rape Elimination Act, and their guidelines and their rules, right, it was very hard for, the line staff to understand how to deal with certain incidents of PREA-related issues. First of all, we got trained in it. Perfect. I got trained in it, and I'm supposed to know what steps to follow. And, but in essence, in reality, I'm a corrections officer. My basics is something occurs, something happens, deal with it, tend to it. I'm not thinking of, medical has to do certain questions need to be asked. The scene needs to be, kind of kept at bay. Nobody walking in, nobody walking out, keeping the evidence in tight. I'm not thinking that. I'm thinking something happened. Maybe it was a fight that occurred. That's what I'm thinking. I'm responding, but not really thinking about, I got to think of PREA first. Or another would be, in New Jersey when we had CF versus Terhune, and we were dealing with special needs inmates that, again, could be decompensating. And I didn't know what to do at that point because I'm a corrections officer. I'm a sergeant. I'm going to deal with this guy who thinks he's not locking in because it's time to take the bus. You're inside of a facility. There are no buses. But now I'm supposed to call the psych. Wait, you're not supposed to put your hands on that guy. Call the psych first because they have to try to see where his mindset is. I'm not thinking about that. And that's where some of the conflict usually happens, when our policies kind of contradict each other.
Yeah, and you know what? I'm going to say, like, for the most part, the conflicts will probably be between custody and another department, only because safety and security is the foundation. So a lot of stuff do go through safety and security, but I'm not saying that it's not going to happen between the other departments. But I would also like to think that administration is also very involved in those other departments as well. And they kind of may already bring some type of community with those, especially when it comes to like releases and just, stuff that really relate to classification and placement, rehabilitation. A lot of focus is on that. But I like what Soto said about PREA. When they write these policies, I think a lot of the times they write these policies and then hand them out to the individual departments, like, this is your role, this is your role, this is your role. But no one's really coming together saying how you roles interact with each other. Like, basically, okay, everybody got their assignment. It's like, imagine if we were doing a play on Broadway and everybody studied for their parts at their house, like right now. And then they say, okay, guys, everybody studied their parts. You all know your lines. Now go do it together for the first time live. Yeah. You know what I mean? There's a finesse. And also on another note that I think Connie was also touching on when it comes to, just kind of working together. I think a bulk of this, and again, I maybe Connie can help me out with the civilian side. I'm going to put a bulk of this pressure on that frontline custody supervisor and bringing things together, but I could be wrong. So I want you to, let me explain my perspective first. I'll definitely get your perspectives on this, because when it comes to, let's say you have, something that happens, usually I see that frontline supervisor, as the one that's collecting the information and trying to generate the story. And then they're the ones compiling it together. So they're getting all the reports and they're kind of making a narrative out of that after the reports have been written. And that's really a bulk of what we look at. After we look at the individual reports, or either way, the foundation of what we really look at is how the supervisor put those reports together. So whether we're getting it from the shift commander or whether we're getting it from the frontline supervisor, or if the shift commander gets it from the frontline supervisor, whatever it is, the person on the floor that's putting together, which I say could be the sergeant, but who knows? I mean, it could be different. They got to create this narrative, and it's not easy. It's not easy because, again, they're blending perspectives that are pretty much operating in an isolated fashion. But would you put a bulk of putting that narrative together? Would you put a bulk of putting that narrative together on that frontline custody, the highest level of frontline custody on that scene? That's for you, Connie, first. And then I want to go to Soto.
So, yeah, I think so. There's a certain level of trust that we defer, right? So we defer to that frontline manager that they know what they're doing, you know, they've got this. We're going to trust their assessment, their judgment, and whatever that narrative is. And I think that's pretty much how we operate. You know, it's kind of like, unless someone else was there that's going to contradict whatever that report says, we're going to go by the report. That is our, you know, body of truth, you know, that we would then operate from. And I think it matters. You know, you mentioned earlier about, you know, social services and like classifications, and just know, like, those are the departments that I think are already integrated into custody. And so the relationship is already in a more positive space, because you guys work together more often than sometimes custody and medical might work together. I feel like there may be some people specific to custody that would work with medical, because maybe that's the clinic captain, or maybe that's the warden, or maybe there's something special going on. Like if someone is like a certain officers that might be assigned to maybe the medical unit or the mental health unit, there's a certain relationship that's there because they work together more often. But what I'm thinking about is there's so many other incidents and situations that happen throughout any compound that would take you away from those specialized units where they already have an integrated relationship.
Right, and I do like that, because you're right. There are some services that are very subordinate to the house because they originate from the house. But again, they may still have their own separate chain of command, but they do understand the needs of the house. And ultimately, you could see that they see that the end game is ultimately going to the same player. But you're right. When you have medical, who could be a vendor, you know, who are just visitors in the house, even though I would like to think we treat them as family, their chain of command is totally different. And now you may have a supervisor who's the supervisor on scene trying to gain the narrative to present whatever the case is eventually to administration, to higher level management. There could be a bit of a struggle when it comes to them trying to get the story they need to piece together something that actually makes sense and kind of alleviates some of the stress of putting it together the next morning. But Soto, can you see that happening a lot with that frontline supervisor trying to scramble, trying to get that story in play before it's passed up?
Yeah, and not only is that frontline supervisor scrambling to get information, it's unfortunate, but we have to be realistic. The frontline supervisor may not have that much or put that much, what can I say? I don't want to, like Connie, you're going to have to forgive me, Connie, but we're picking on medical today. So I know that Gangi, just you touched on a point where now medical has been in many places, you know, outsourced, and we have vendors that actually now tend. So there is no relationship between you and, you know, those nurses that are only being hired for the day for per diems. They're not your regular normal, and they're there. So me as the frontline supervisor, I'm just going to say, wait a minute, just put a Band-Aid on this guy so I can get my reports ready, you know, and I can place him or her and go on about what I need to do, and not put so much effort into getting all the information that I should get from the medical department. You know, they're doing an examination. They're seeing what evidence might be there, what, you know, if there's injuries, whether the person is decompensating, whether they're at risk of committing suicide, right? Because they have to ask those questions. And being the frontline supervisor, I may be jumping to conclusions without getting all the information I need to compile that whole narrative that you're talking about.
Right. And again, I could picture myself being a supervisor and then, you know, trying to find some type of, consistency between what I'm getting from, you know, one department and then what I'm trying to get from my own. Because don't forget, it's not even just the different departments, it's the multiple people involved. You know, I could get inconsistency from my own people that I have to fix. And then I get inconsistency from another department that I have to blend in. And then that supervisor now has to try to piece things together, because at the end of the day, I do know for a fact, management does rely on the highest level report for a complete picture. And then eventually, if there's concerns with that complete picture, it may lead us to, oh, you know what, let me look a little further down. Let's start seeing these individual reports because something's not connecting right, you know? And then again, that's just basically, it's kind of what helps us get through the day. I'll be honest with you, because again, there's so many reports being written, but unless there's a reason for a flag, you go by who's been able to create the narrative that really involves a complete picture from all angles. And again, that usually goes to that highest level of authority on that scene. I would also like to mention, maybe Connie, you could kind of help out with this more, but I think at the front line, and guys, just for advice, this is why we are talking about the front line. I know I said we're going to cross into management a little bit, but I think we could start bringing it to the front line. Is that at the front line, that's where, to me, you're going to learn the most about the practices that are being applied. Like, okay, as management, I'm going to understand policy, but, reading it and actually doing it are two different things. So I think that when I'm on the front line, and guys, if you're on the front line right now, this is a great chance for you to see the different policies in action, because you're going to see how it's applied by the different individuals live and in the moment. So maybe when it's being done, if you get a chance to ask somebody, hey, why did you do it that way? And if they're able to know why, hopefully they do know why, you could start building up, probably, to me, a bridge that will start, showing people, because this is the next step of corrections, guys. The next step of corrections is that we have to stop operating in silos. We have to start working together. So I think that starts when the different departments start asking why we do things the way we do, because it's in those whys that we'll start constructing how we can work together. Because if I don't know why you do it, or the why, I don't really care why you do it, then I'm going to start doing things on my own. But if I start asking why and really care about the why from the frontline perspective, because now imagine this, Connie, imagine this. Imagine if we do present something at a higher level and we're starting to complete the picture, and when asked what happens, it would be great if you can have an officer say, well, by the way, the reason why we had to do it that way is because medical also needed to get this done, or vice versa. If medical's telling the vendor, hey, I know you saw this, but mind you, custody has to get these stuff done. I don't think we see a lot of that. Do you, Connie, or am I wrong?
No, I mean, I think the amount of communication that's needed, I don't think that usually happens, right? Like, I don't know that in the moment we're helping each other fill in the blanks. I mean, I think, there's a lot of effort in just getting the report done and moving on to the next task, whatever that is. I don't know. I mean, and when Lou mentioned the per diem, all I kept thinking was they have no idea though, right? Like they have, I mean, yes. So maybe if you're a regular per diem, like you just pick up hours and then you kind of get accustomed to the environment and you know how to respond to situations, that's one thing. But if you get like these random per diems that have no idea of the operational practices, or they have no idea of how custody and medical do work together, like we're already in a bad space. So I could actually just see how a lack of communication would certainly impact our ability to be supportive of each other, especially being supportive of the front line, because we're not helping them fill the gaps, the knowledge gaps, in order to know what to do for next time. So like, for example, if I just did everything I needed to do and I never communicated with the officer what I did or why I did it, he will never know what I did and why I did it. I mean, you could read it in a report, but to understand like, well, this is why the inmate was placed on their side versus placed on their back or being placed on their stomach, right? If I never articulate that to the officer, he may not know the next time this happens in the unit what he should have done. You know what I'm saying? Like, I feel like there's just these times where we're not communicating and we're not filling in the gaps. And I don't know if it's just that we don't feel like we're responsible for helping each other or educating each other on these things. I don't know.
Well, it's funny. Maybe I'm sure Soto's been through this too, where you could have a conflict between two departments because the conflicts are really based on, well, if I do this for medical, then I'm violating my policy, or if medical does this for me, then they're violating their policy. And I think when it comes to that, and there's no effort to concede, now what you're going to have is two people that are not looking to work together because they're more concerned about, I'm not going to do that, because if I do that, that breaks away from policy and it's going to be my ass. And medical's like, well, I'm not going to do that because if it breaks with my policy, it's my ass. But here's the problem here, though. And again, I hate that we keep on choosing medical, but again, guys, this could happen anywhere. But you got to realize something. Are we dealing with these incidences in isolated manners, which means this? If the end result is, let's say I concede on custody's level to help medical, does great. They get their accolades. Custody gets written up because, again, two different parties reviewing the situation. At the end, they're not coming together. It's just medical's taking their route because they're a vendor and they got their own people. And hey, great job on medical, but custody's getting slammed because they had to violate a rule or they, to kind of work with medical and vice versa. What about if, custody explains safety and security? It's like, hey, great job for custody. You really kept, but, having said that, it was a violation on medical. So medical's getting slammed and custody's getting the accolades. I mean, can you see that happening, Soto?
Yeah, I think I've given you this example a couple other times where I was a brand new first line supervisor, and I went onto a unit, and it was a stabilization unit, basically where when people decompose or mental illness is hitting them hard, they go into this stabilization unit for a couple of days, maybe 10 days at the most, where the psychiatrist try to work with the individual, the inmate, and get them stabilized again. Well, my officers were breaking our policy where anybody coming out, this is still considered a secured area of the facility, and you have to handcuff the individual because a couple of days earlier, you probably had to restrain them just to get them to the stabilization unit. So they were handcuffing the inmate from the front, right? Their hands right in front of them. And that was against our policy because our policy at the time was everybody has to be handcuffed in the back. So I told my officers, look, security first. You have to handcuff them behind their backs. And I didn't pay attention to what the psych department needed because in order for them to perform their job, they need the person to be comfortable, the person to be, forthcoming, and being handcuffed in the back and placed in a chair in an uncomfortable position may not, help them to get into that right mindset. So we had to actually work together, come up with a solution where, we used kind of like the restraint belt or chain that goes around the waist, cuff them in the front, but that's also restraint in the front, but the person can sit comfortably one-on-one with the psych. And mental wise, it puts the person in a better state than being handcuffed in the back, thinking I'm doing something wrong and why I'm not going to be forthcoming and talking to you. So those are things that kind of come up that you have to work together in order to come up with the best solutions.
Right. I want people to know it's not a win-loss because especially from the management level, it's if one department loses, the whole house loses. I mean, that's just how it is. And we can't be in that departmental survival mode to the point that we're only concerned about our mission or our departmental objectives and just eliminate everybody else's needs, especially when obviously they interact with each other. If I can give one more advice to the front line, and again, just from being up there and then looking back down, wishing I would have done these things more is I wish that honestly, I know this may sound a little crazy, but even when taking a break and officers sometimes have to break, obviously in the facility, they can't leave for most places, not all, some do get that break, believe it or not. If you get a chance to interact with the other departments, because the reason why I'm putting a lot of weight on custody, not because it's just my backbone, but because it is it's the canvas of a facility. So I do put a lot of stuff here on custody in regards to the interactions, because no one's ever going to argue. It is custody's house. I like to think that's the case. It is custody's house, and custody does whatever they can to facilitate the needs of the people that also have stuff involved in that house. But at the end of the day, safety and security is paramount. At any time, we could be locked down and we could prove, whose house it is. But at the end, everybody still has equal value in this house. They do. But when you get into that emergency situation, it'll be a quick reminder that, okay, it's totally custody. And we're familiar with that. But because I'm leaning towards that, and if anybody wants to question that, please, by all means, because I don't want to come up as being rude. I just, I'm dealing with the highest level, an emergency situation. We know for a fact it's going to go to custody, but I'm also going to put a lot of it on custody as well in regards to bringing that house together. in regards to talking to those different departments, especially at the front line, because most of the stuff that has to happen is going to go through custody anyway. So a good understanding of what these different departments do, especially at the front line, will help you when you become that frontline supervisor and you're trying to create that narrative that involves all these different departments. And I'm going to tell you something, guys, a cohesive narrative from a lot of different departments that were involved will help you with lawsuits later on when everybody's on the same page, as opposed to, everybody writing it differently, because then it's easier to separate when the lawyers get involved, because I'll tell you something, lawyers will know, that those reports were written in separation. And management, we don't want that. We want a cohesive story so no one could pick it apart. So we could see that, these definitely worked well together. And we could see that. Trust and believe, when you read it, you could see, wow, medical and custody, or, this department and this department, wow, they really work together. How can you tell? Look at the narrative. Look at the individual reports. Because at the end, when all this gets shipped up, it goes from the narratives to those individual reports. And those individual reports will strengthen the narrative. But in the end, I really do think it's an effort for custody at least. But I would like to say for all departments. But I'm going to put a little bit on custody here, because I think the other departments, they do have a lot of stuff that kind of are obvious that they have to get together, like the release process, stuff like that. So they're brought to the table a lot to have discussions and settle issues. I don't think custody has that opportunity unless it's emergent and needed. So if we have an incident, let's go back, bring people together. I like what you guys said before. We should do that more often with custody and have them involved in those meetings, but not just the high level custody. I'm talking about the front line, the ones that are on the floor, and just get an understanding of the whys. And then as you start to move up from front line, that helps with the scramble. But when you move up to management, man, it's great, because you're alleviating some of the bias, and you're starting to be able to create a bigger picture that will actually help you, control the house a lot better. But what's your thoughts on that, Soto? Do you agree from that high level and the front line?
No, I absolutely agree. Looking back in hindsight, I wish that I was able to, as a frontline officer, have the opportunity to be involved in some of the decision makings, or at least to put input, right, in things and how they manage and how things get developed. So if I would put it on myself as well, I should have taken more time, because I did do it, but I needed more time with other departments like social services, even food service. Sometimes we get into it with food service because they don't understand, or they may not know that if they serve that disgusting meal, it's going to cause a problem for the rest of the correctional facility, because we're the ones dealing with the inmate population. So it can happen with any department, and I would put it on myself as well, as a frontline officer, that I should have reached out more, learned a lot more, which would have made it easier as I moved up in rank and went up into management.
And Connie, I see you nodding in agreement. What's your thoughts?
No, I think Soto is spot on. At the end of the day, I think when we come into the system, we do our best to learn our jobs, right? And I don't know that we know enough to know that these are opportunities for us to learn and to be working better with our coworkers, right? Because for me, even though I was in custody, I think I was nervous enough to know, I was like, oh man, I'm a little shaky. I need to find out from custody what I need to do, right? And people say, well, why don't you just go to another civilian? I'm like, because they don't know. They're not going to know the custody procedures. Yes, there's some things that you're familiar with because you worked there a long time, right? But to really get the insight on what we do, why we do it, and how it matters if I do this or I do that, I think that those who are on the front line, they do have the opportunity to truly integrate and create that cohesion. It's just finding the time to be able to do that. Like you mentioned, when you take your lunch break, right? I don't know of many officers who took a break and came on over to medical, right? Like, I just don't know that being the case, right? Because you want a breather from what's going on in the unit. The last thing you want to be is in the midst of medical where you got another set of chaos, because then something goes down in medical, you have to respond whether you want to break or not, right? So it's kind of figuring out, what's the best way for us to really like come together. And I do believe that there are opportunities for that. Like, so when we are looking at policies and procedures, like to bring someone in from the other teams, right? How do we bring others in and have, true integration or contributions into the development of these policies? Because that's how people start taking ownership. I was a part of that. Oh yeah, this is why we did that. And the word gets around that, like, nah, custody was a part of the medical discussion. We were all at the table talking about why you can't just let the pregnant women not be handcuffed, right? Like it's, I think those are the opportunities that we create. Even though policy doesn't say we should do this thing or that thing, we can create those opportunities where we show that we respect each other's positions as well as, their perspectives. And we want to make sure that we are taking into account everyone who has a stake in the game.
And it kind of made me think of something before we come to a close, was that when I look into a break room, what I kind of meant was you can kind of see the groups. So I'll give you an example. When I used to stand mess at one of the facilities I worked at, I'd be like, okay, the Crips sit here, the Bloods sit here, the Kinks sit here, the Nietas, the whatever. So now when I go to our break room, it's like, okay, that's social services. This is mental health. This is medical. This is custody. And then once in a while, same thing as you get that floater who decides to sit at every freaking table. You know what I mean? But again, it would be great if one day you walk in and you couldn't tell which department people belong to, and that you saw the interaction. So guys, if you're there, and let's say one day, you're at the break hall, feel free and sit at someone else's table. You know what I mean? See if you're accepted or if you get hit with a tray. I don't know how that's going to work. But hey, Soto, do you have anything you want to say in closing?
Well, in closing, I just tell everyone the same thing. Take those opportunities, reach out, work it out. Work it out. It makes your job a whole lot easier when you have someone you can pick up the phone and say, hey, I know someone in medical, I know someone in social services, I know someone in food service that can take care of this issue on my tier. And knowledge is power. So please stay safe.
Yeah, it's very powerful. Knowledge is definitely power. Hey, Connie, anything you want to say in closing?
I just want to say, I just want the front line to know that they're not forgotten. We understand the complexities of working in facility. We understand that sometimes the expectations may be unrealistic because you may not be prepared for the next crazy thing that's going to happen, but hopefully, management knows enough to know to try to be supportive and to try to not. So there may be some ramifications, right? If you mess up, right? Like that's just a reality. But we don't want to kill your spirit of like curiosity and wanting to do a good job. And sometimes the consequences really does make people recoil a bit. And so if there's anything at all, just understand that we get that, these decisions are really complex. And we hope that you have management teams that are going to try to help you work through them and support you through the process.
And just to balance out what Soto and Connie mentioned, just in my closing, is that if you notice, this all went right back to the front line and learning what you could. Knowledge is power, and being able to bring that to the top and being able to understand, like, hey, I know how this stuff works because I've been there and I made the effort. So if you see this as a career, it's great to treat it as a career from day one and not just decide I'm going to do it because I'm in this new position now. No, do it because, you want to take it serious, because I'm telling you, it will help you as you move up. And one last thing, I just wanted to say something. It's great when we do a video and people listen to the advice and they apply it. Recently, we did a video where someone was motivated by what we did and they applied it. And then they said, hey, Gangi, this worked. But if it wasn't for your panel, your videos, I wouldn't have thought about doing that. But I also want to say, it's not just about what we provide here, but having the heart to do it. because a lot of the stuff that we talk about, a lot of the stuff that we discuss is not reactionary. It's literally you're pioneering. So to be able to step up and apply what we're teaching, I think is more humbling than, you know, anything that I've ever, you know, dealt with. I just to hear that, hey, Gangi, I trusted you enough, or I trusted your panel enough to take this advice, you know, in my career, in my job, in what I do to pay for my family's well-being. I trusted your advice enough. I trusted Connie's. I trusted Soto's advice enough to do that. And, you know, that says a lot about what we offer here, but a lot about the people who look for the information. I want to say one last thing. This channel is not about entertaining. This channel is about information and sometimes an education. Sometimes entertainment and education, they don't run parallel, because if I look to entertain somebody, I look to create a message that they want to hear. They want to stay connected to. But when you look to educate and when you look to get the right message out there, it may not always be what they want to hear. It may not be always what they want to take in. But about education is the message doesn't change, regardless of what the audience wants. The message is consistent because that's what brings the best results. So I just wanted to get that out there. Influencers, a lot of responsibility as an influencer. So everybody on this panel, people that listen, you know, it takes a lot to do this and, you know, wait for the results, especially if you care for what we're providing. And again, just thank you for the support and thank you for the trust in implementing what we do. As always, guys, the show is Tear Talk. If you haven't, please subscribe, interact, engage, comment, hit that bell. Bell's going to notify you every time I post a video. Stay safe.